It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to look intently. We're going to examine, we're going to break it apart into its atoms, a PFL contract. We are also going to take a really quick look at what's going on with GFL, the Global Fight League, at the top here. But first, let's check in with John and see how his week has been.
Good. I'm back in LA. The weather's nice. Went to the beach, took my mom to the beach today. And that's about it. Sat at the beach and I had a couple, I don't drink much anymore, but I had a couple cocktails at the beach. That was nice. Very nice day.
Super duper. And the cat and mom are getting along better. We love that.
God,
yes,
no. She is plotting the murder of my mom right now. She is so mad at me. She's mad at me for having my mom here. So I don't know. She keeps staring at me like, what is that woman still doing here? So, and my mom's upset because every other person I take over that comes over, my brother, his girlfriend, my girlfriend, the cat loves them, but only my mom.
Well, maybe she's not been around an older person before.
I think, or she might have been around an older person, holds a grudge against the elderly for some reason. Who knows?
Maybe. I'm sure they'll work their differences.
They're not. Yeah, it's been a while. I don't think they're working it out. She's, but yeah, the cat's gone through some traumatic stuff, so I give her a pass.
All right. Well, right now, let's talk about Global Fight League because I can't help but notice, and several others have noticed as well, that lots and lots of PFL and Bellator fighters are now over on the GFL website. And I'm not talking about the smallish names either. There's a lot of prominent names there. Yoel Romero, Thiago Santos. Thiago Santos, I'll ask you about him in a second. Brett Johns, Julia Budd, Kat Zingano, Aspen Ladd, Ilima Leigh McFarland, multi-time flyweight women's champion for Bellator, and Ilima Leigh McFarland, Arlene Blenko, Darian Caldwell, Kai Kamaka III, who came over from UFC, Lance Palmer, Pedro Carvalho, Anthony Pettis, Sydney Outlaw, and Neiman Gracie. Back to Thiago Santos for just a moment. I couldn't help but notice that they have him listed twice, both in heavyweight and light heavyweight divisions. I have several questions. First, what do you make of all of these bigger names over there on GFL's website? 2, what do you make of Thiago Santos being listed in 2 weight divisions? And 3, is GFL a legit thing or is this kind of a grift?
Well, first of all, the names, I think it says to me is that PFL has decided they can't keep all the Bellator fighters. They're releasing a large numbers of them. 1 is because they just have too many fighters, can't supply fights. 2 is some of them are more expensive than the PFL fighters. So I guess there's 3. And then the third one would be a lot of those fighters, I'm sure, do not want to take part in the new format and sign the new contracts that PFL wants everybody to sign. So put those together. That's a bunch of fighters released, including, I guess there's word now that Patricky Pitbull is with GFL. I don't know if that's official or not. I mean, they announced it, but there's been a lot of stepping back from stuff that's been announced for GFL. So that's why I think those guys are over there. For Thiago, if you draft him, and we can get to the draft later, what I think the draft really is he a two-way player? In other words, do you get to, if you draft him, can you put him at light heavyweight, or can 2 different teams draft him? It leaves open a lot of possibilities. My guess, though, considering a lot of the mistakes, the announcements of fighters that are not eligible to be in the GFL, the announcement of a fighter who's in prison right now, and stuff like that, is they have some overworked interns that make some mistakes in some of the fighters. And I'm guessing Santos being on 2 weight classes might be one of those, or maybe they are. They're saying he can fight in both weight divisions. I'm not sure. So as being a grift, I don't think I think they're honestly trying. I mean, I've talked to some people before. I think it's a serious attempt. I don't think it's a grift. I think they're in some ways overloaded. You know, it doesn't sound like they have a massive staff. It doesn't sound like they have they don't have tons of money available to them immediately. So there's going to be a lot of mistakes. And, you know, we also question the format to begin with. So there's that to go for it as well. But I don't think it's a grip, but I also am not confident it's the future of MMA.
Let's talk about that draft for a second, because another thing that's been pointed out on social media by Carbazal MMA, I just want to shout him out because he's the one that pointed it out, that their YouTube for the Global Fight League, their YouTube only has 323 subscribers, and they are promoting that this draft is going to take place live, and at the top of the list of places you can watch it is their YouTube, which only has 323 subscribers, and they have nothing on the schedule for the draft. They have nothing announcing that there will be a draft either on their own YouTube. Now, they are saying that there are other places the draft is going to be, but what do you make of that part?
Well, I think that's a big part of what I talked about earlier. They don't have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of staff. They don't have a lot of people, probably a lot of overworked interns doing this. Because you'd think you would roll out a bunch of videos and promos and stuff to build it up. Interest in the GFL and also interest in your YouTube channel so people could watch it, make it easier to watch. That's what you do if you have the resources and the people to do it. And that suggests to me they don't, and they're kind of, they are supposedly financed right now, well-financed. I shouldn't say well-financed, but they have financing to cover them. But I don't know when that was cleared or when that came through. So they might not have had the money to begin with, and they were moving ahead before all the I's were crossed and the T's dotted.
What about the draft itself? What do you think of it?
I mean, my understanding, and I don't know if this is true, my understanding, it's not a real draft. That the fight, first of all, they have too many fighters eligible for the draft that are going to be camping the league. So a lot of guys who have signed contracts, and I'll put that in air quotes, with GFL will not be in the GFL after the draft, because the GFL will use their option will exercise their option not to have them. So they'll be terminated. So they will never take part in the GFL. So that's going to be a much smaller pool of fighters than what they announce. The announcement is purely to draw interest. And then top of it, my understanding is they're not a real draft. These teams are not drafting people like in competition with each other. That it's determined ahead of time which fighters are going to which team. Again, this is what I heard. That it might come out that it's different. Maybe GFL will show that it's a real draft. My understanding, it's not. The fighters are assigned to teams, and fighters are picked. So that would make sense, because they probably are thinking about the budget. Some of these fighters' contracts are going to be too big, and that they've offered, and so limit the budget, limit the number of bigger name fighters, spread them out. And but the draft is purely a gimmick, at least as I was informed, a gimmick to draw interest. We'll see, though.
Well, all right. Now, we talked about all of these Bellator names, and you mentioned how some of them didn't, it could be that some of them did not want to sign PFL's new contracts. And funnily enough, that is what this episode, the meat and potatoes of it, that's what it's about, is the PFL contract. And John, his sticky little fingers have come across some PFL contracts. And boy, oh boy, there's lots of stuff in them that we're going to take a look at, a deep dive into them. So John, are you ready?
I am. I should note, first of all, what I have to do is I get several different contracts from different fighters and managers to make sure the same contents are in them. So the one we're going to look at is the standard contract. Now, we will discuss a few differences between some of the other contracts. Specifically, it seemed to be those offered to the bigger Bellator stars, or bigger, the higher paid Bellator fighters. But for this, we'll go through the standard, and then I'll add some notes about some of the other variables that exist in some of the other contracts we've seen.
All right. So first off, we're going to talk about term. This agreement shall begin on the effective date and shall continue in full force and effect for a period of 24 months. Thereafter, the initial term may be renewed, extended, or terminated in accordance with the agreement. Tell me about that.
Well, that's just your common terms. Like UFC will say, we'll offer you 6 fights over 24 months or 5 fights over 20 months. That's the typical UFC contract along with that. This term is the length of time. And I will note some of the higher paid Bellator fighters, I've noticed their term is usually just a 1-year period instead of the 2-year periods here that seem to be the vast majority of fighters are offered. Some of the Bellator type, at least maybe it's some non-Bellator fighters, I guess I'd have to look at the check, but some of the bigger name fighters, the higher paid ones, they have 1-year terms instead of these 2-year terms.
Fighter activity. PFL guarantees that it shall offer fighter the opportunity to compete in 2 MMA bouts during each 12-month period during the term. Let's talk about fighter activity.
Well, this is your basically your minimum bouts. You'll get 2 fights per year. So you have a 2-year contract. So the contract lasts 2 years. Each year you'll get a minimum 2 fights. So like I said, UFC, it says 4 fights over 24 months. Now, in some ways, this is better than the UFC because you know what's going to happen in a 2-month period. You're going to be offered in a 12-month period. You're going to be offered at least 2 fights. As we noticed in the UFC, they can give you a fight. And then they can kind of wait till the very end and make you sit for almost a whole year before giving you your second, third, and fourth fight to finish out the contract. And here it's all, they have a minimum bouts per year. Now I should know it. Some of the better Bellator fighters, I didn't notice. I looked through the whole contract on several of them. I didn't see a fighter activity. So on the standard PFL contract, they have this fighter activity provision, but on some of the Bellator contract ones, I shouldn't say Bellator, the fighters coming from Bellator or coming from other places besides Bellator that are higher paid fighters, they didn't have a fighter activity provision, which means, you look through it, what are the minimum amount of bouts? Do they even have to offer you fights? That's a little alarming. And that's something, if you're representing them, you'd say, listen, we need to have minimum bouts because otherwise we could just sit the whole year.
Wow. Okay. That's alarming for sure. Yeah. Let's talk about compensation. Can you tell us how, according to this new contract, how the compensation works?
Well, they break it in several sections. They have what's called the standard bouts, standard MMA bouts, a tournament championship bonus, a title challenge compensation increase, and then title defense compensation and alternate. So we'll go through the standard MMA bouts is when you do any sort of fight, you have, a win and show and win. For most persons, it's 50-50. I've noticed others go up, though. Some are 60 and 60, 65, 65, 100, 100, 150, 150. I can't remember, maybe 200, 250, way up there for some of the highest ones, which, it's pretty good for a PFL fighter. Those are the highest ones I remember seeing amongst all the contracts, or at least confirmed by some of the managers. But the standard is 50 and 50 and up to 100 and 100 for some of the bigger name, higher ranked fighters. And so works just like any other, purse. You show, you get 50, and you win, you get your 50-year win bonus. Now in the tournament championship, you get the same pay as you do as your standard, but at the end of the tournament championship, you get a bonus. And the standard one for this is $500,000 if you win the tournament championship. Some fighters have higher bonuses. Some fighters have, I can't remember if it's 650, 750, but higher than that 500,000. But 500,000 is the standard. But unlike the previous PFL contracts where the total prize was $1 million for winning the whole tournament, this is you get your show win, and then there's a bonus at the end. So for a lot of fighters, after 3 fights, you will end up with, for not a lot, but for some of them, you'll end up more than $1 million. And for others, you will end up with less, but you get a higher guaranteed per bout. Now, then there's the title challenger compensation. This is basically if you fight for like a Bellator title, you get a bonus for fighting for the title, and then you get a bonus when you defend it. And I think the standard is $50,000 bonus, a $50,000 bonus to your show, your guaranteed purse, and a $50,000 win if you are doing a challenger, and then it doubles $100,000 if you are the champion. But again, you get to some of the select better known fighters, and they have much higher championship bonuses and title defense bonuses than that. But that's the standard. And then there's the thing, they have an alternate. This is kind of interesting. And
this is the one that caught my eye right here, the alternate one.
Which is kind of new. But in the event the fighter is designated as an alternate for any MMA bout under this agreement, fighter makes weight, is ready, willing, and able to compete in an applicable event as determined by the Athletic Commission and PFL, PFL will pay the fighter $10,000 of the readiness amount. So they can designate you an alternate. You don't have a bout, but you have an alternate. And if you make weight and are ready, they give you $10,000, which, it's pales compared to the UFC, but I guess they also have some compensation to have you ready to do as an alternate to compete.
That's pretty cool. Let's talk about an alternate opponent. It says, if any MMA bout in which fighter is contracted to participate in accordance with this agreement fails to occur due to no fault of fighter or on fighter's behalf in part or in whole, then PFL shall pay fighter the applicable show amount stated above. If fighter's opponent is not able to perform, PFL will consult with fighter and or fighter's representatives, and PFL will have the right, but not the obligation, to provide a reasonable alternate opponent for fighter in such MMA bout. If PFL so provides an alternative opponent for fighter and fighter chooses not to participate in such MMA bout with such alternate opponent, then PFL shall have no obligation to compensate fighter in connection with such MMA bout, but shall still provide incidentals incurred by fighter under Section 9 below.
Well, and this is something that I'm sure a lot of fans and fighters would be happy to see, is what they're saying is if they have you an opponent for you and that opponent drops out, you've signed the bout agreement, you have a contracted opponent and he drops out, they guarantee you are going to get your guaranteed show purse, which is great for a lot of fighters. They would love to get their guaranteed show purse. It's not guaranteed. It's always a bonus when you get that. But here's the twist on this, or I guess the catch, is if they offer you an alternate opponent and you turn it down, you do not get that guaranteed amount. So you still can turn on the alternate opponent, but you don't get that guaranteed. And so that might explain why they have that alternate provision, because if you think about it, they're doing these tournaments, they could have a handful of fighters stand by an alternate, pay them $10,000, which is not a lot. And if a fighter misses weight or drops out, they now have someone to offer that fighter to take a bout. Otherwise, they would have to offer them their show pay. So they still are going to get a bout out of that fighter most of the times instead of offering them the guaranteed show pay without taking a fight.
Talk to us about what incidentals are.
Well, we see these in all the contracts, your flights. This details all the stuff that PFL is going to take care of for you. That all the other promotions do as well. It guarantees you 2 economy class domestic round trips for the fighter in one corner. It offers you a room. It offers you meals, $100 per day per diem or per night per room, I should say. So I think you have to split that then with the person you're with for the allowance. And then for title bouts, you get an extra $50. And then you get incidentals for promotional activities. So they also pay for your room, your flight, and your meals when you're doing promotional work for the company.
All right. Now we're going to go down to the section that is Exhibit A, Terms and Conditions. We're going to go to number 3 called Term. And basically there are several subterms under that. So if you would go through those for us, that would be awesome.
All right. So we have as you said, the Exhibit A, Terms and Conditions, the additional part that for the individual fighter, this is the standard contract again. So in this, they have a renewal option under the terms. So if they have the right, PFL has the right to renew your contract, and they have the option to renew the agreement for 1 year following the initial term. So you have a 2-year contract in the as we noted, right? After those 2 years, they can renew you for 1 year. If they have a championship option on top of that, in the event that the final year of the term, fighters either one wins the championship MMA bout or is the holder of the world title, the PFL shall have the right and option to renew the agreement for up to 1 additional year. So after 3 years, let's say, they can extend it for another year, for 4 years. Technically, this could be a 4-year contract. Now, the number of bouts is interesting because it doesn't say the number of bouts. You get 2 minimum, but you could be in tournaments every year. Or you could do extra bouts. So unlike, again, the typical MMA contract that says 5 fights over 20 months, this is 2 years with an option for another year. A championship option would be a 4th year. And at all those years, you could be fighting anywhere from 1 to 4 times, let's say, or none, as we noted in the previous ones, if you don't have a minimum inactivity clause.
Quick question before we move forward on this. We keep noting that this contract is 2 years. Was their previous contract also 2 years or longer, just for comparison's sake?
The one we looked at, I believe, was a 2-year agreement, but there were several different ones.
Okay.
But technically, if you look at this renewal term, it's exclusively up to PFL, the renewal option. Mm-hmm. So truthfully, this is a 3-year contract. It's 2 years, your two normal years, and then PFL has the unilateral option to renew it. So it's a 3-year option in PFL's eyes, but they can also, if they just don't want to pay you, make it a 2-year. And then there's the championship clause. So that's the first two options. Then we have a condition of tournament participation, and which is as a condition of fighters' participation in any round of the world tournament, fighter shall be required to participate in all the tournament MMA bouts which the fighter qualifies to compete in. And in the event that the fighter lose in either the quarterfinal or semifinal rounds, fighter will remain ready, willing, and available to compete for the duration of the world tournament, so that the fighter may be utilized as an alternate. If necessary, fighter acknowledges and agrees that in the event that the term of this agreement is scheduled to expire prior to the conclusion of a world tournament in which fighter is a participant, then the term shall automatically be extended through the day after conclusion of championship for the world tournament. So again, you have the terms, and then if the tournament continues past your option or your terms of your agreement, it can be extended further to cover the tournament. In addition, if in the event that an MMA bout is postponed or unable to be scheduled due to an injury, disability, illness, retirement, et cetera, basically any reason whatsoever, the terms of the agreement should automatically be extended by a period of time that is reasonable under the circumstances given PFL's event schedule, which is one-sided in my book, but it's also very common amongst MMA promotions. So that's the terms, all the terms that the fighter has to work on.
All right. So we are moving on down to Section 4, promotional rights and MMA bouts. We're going to look at Section 4.6. John, you want to take that away?
Yes. Okay. For 4.6, PFL may split all fight payments hereunder such that a portion of the fight amount and win amount for any MMA bout are paid pursuant to the applicable bout agreement, and the remainder is paid pursuant to an accompanying marketing addendum. For clarity, the title amount shall be paid contemporaneously with the applicable MMA bout. Fighter agrees to sign the standard marketing addendum and fully perform all promotional activities in accord with the agreement. Well, this is interesting because what I don't have, and no one gave me, is the marketing addendum, right? So I am guessing we saw something like this with Mousasi in his current suit with PFL, with Bellator gave him an additional payment for marketing, right? Mm-hmm. It was kind of like his version of a side letter was this. I'm guessing this might be something like that, which is that the PFL might have an addendum where if you do marketing work for the event or for the PFL, they can pay you additional money, but they can determine how it's going to be split as part of your win amount purse or as the remainder being paid as your promotional money.
Okay. Now, our next section under the number 5, it's called promotional activities. I'm going to read this one, section 5.1. Fighter agrees throughout the term to assist PFL as requested by PFL in the marketing, advertising, publicity, and promotion of MMA bouts, whether or not fighter competes in such MMA bouts, for no additional compensation. Fighter will participate in a reasonable number of marketing, advertising, publicity, and promotional activities as requested and directed by PFL, including without limitation, the following activities, collectively known as the promotional activities. A, in-person and or remote press conferences and interviews with various media outlets, television, print, radio, internet, etc. B, webcasts, podcasts, and chats. C, photo and or video shoots. D, personal appearances, ceremonial weigh-ins, autograph signings, without limiting the foregoing for a period beginning 60 days prior to and ending 30 days following any MMA bout hereunder. Fighter shall make himself available to be recorded and to appear in any audio and or audio-visual programming designated by PFL in order to promote fighter, PFL and or such MMA bout or any future MMA bout. Fighter shall not be required to travel for promotional activities during the 3 weeks before fighter has a scheduled MMA bout, except for travel to the site of the MMA bout. 10% of the guaranteed purse and win bonus, if any, for each fighter's MMA bouts hereunder shall be withheld by PFL until fighter has satisfactorily completed the required promotional activities for given MMA bout. It's called a promotional holdback. If the event fighter fails to complete the specified promotional activities associated with a given MMA bout, the promotional holdback shall be forfeited as liquidated damages for non-performance, and PFL shall have no further liability to fighter in connection with such promotional holdback amount. Fighters' participation in the promotional activities and a material provision of this agreement and fighters' failure to participate as reasonably required or directed by PFL following reasonable advance notice shall constitute a material breach and shall entitle PFL to terminate this agreement with no further obligation to fighter or impose a penalty of $1,000 per infraction. Subject to PFL's prior written approval, PFL agrees to reimburse fighter for the reasonable, documented out-of-pocket costs actually incurred by fighter in connection with participating in promotional activities. That was a mouthful. Please tell me what I just read.
Well, that was very long. But what I found interesting about it basically is you have a bunch of responsibilities for the fighter to do promotion. And where the UFC, again, we'll use the UFC as a comparison, the UFC has the athletic kick bonus, right? Your outfitting policy, where you have to do all these responsibilities. If you don't get your, what we used to call the Reebok money, and now it's your Venom kit or whatever it is, the bonus athletic pay that they give you for the sponsorship. And this, the PFL, a little different because they don't have the money. They penalize the fighter 10% of his purse if they fail to do it. And then they also have fines. I mean, the UFC had fines before, which they almost never use, but here they have, they can impose a penalty of $1,000 per infraction. So where the UFC, what they do is they withhold your bonus pay if you don't follow don't do your obligations. PFL does follows the path of penalizing you out of your purse if you fail to do it.
I have a question for you. This one is what made me chuckle a little bit, was that for no additional compensation, they have to do all this marketing, and that it might not even be for their own fight. For no additional compensation. That's the first sentence. The end of the first sentence says for no additional compensation. That just doesn't seem fair to me.
Well, sadly it isn't. Most contracts have it. Even the UFC has. They say they'll be compensated. They indicate that there's no guarantee. If we go back years ago too, there's a big problem with that when Roger Huerta had to do promotional stuff and didn't get paid. The UFC does do a pretty good job of paying people now to fly around and do promotions, but in almost all MMA contracts, it has some promotional activities attached to it that you have to do, even if it's not your bout. You have to show up and make an appearance. And I guess their reasoning is you're promoting yourself. You're there to promote another bout, but you're bringing your as a fighter, your star power to help promote it.
Fighters have to submit sponsors to PFL. Does that mean they get their own sponsors? How does that work?
Well, it's interesting. In the contract, it talks about you have to submit sponsors to be approved, but it doesn't talk about you having your own sponsors. That would be in the promotional or merchandising agreement they have, which is not attached to these contracts. But we had Don Davis on with Mike Heck and MMA Fighting in a Q&A, and I've heard from other people. As we know, the PFL is they let you have a patch on your uniforms. So there's that. And as he said, the uniforms will only be for the tournament, and for the super fights or whatever the names of their other brands are, which are basically like Bellator events, fighters will have their own sponsorship. But they'll have to get it cleared through PFL, so it's not in conflict with PFL. So that's very much, it's kind of a combination of the PFL system, where PFL fighters have uniforms. At least that's the way it sounds. We don't have that addendum to examine exactly. But the way it reads here is it's going to be like for the PFL tournaments, you're in a kit for those unique super events, whatever the PFL Championship Series, whatever. I can't know what name they're calling it now, all the different brands. For those, you will operate more like Bellator, where fighters have their own sponsors.
We are going to move on down to section 7.5 to be exact. If PFL fails to timely pay fighter in accordance with the express terms and conditions of this agreement, or otherwise allegedly breaches any of PFL's other obligations hereunder, PFL shall have until 15 days of receipt of detailed written notice of such alleged default delivered by fighter to remedy such breach. Until the receipt of such written notice and the expiration of such time to cure, during which time PFL fails to reasonably cure such alleged breach, PFL shall not be considered in breach of any of the terms and or conditions of this agreement. What does that mean?
Well, it means basically what it means is that if they don't have to pay you right away, and it reminds me a little bit of the GFL contract. Remember that had that provision clause that we don't pay you, we have a amount of time for remedy. For theirs it was like 30 days. I don't know if they lifted this from this or if GFL got it from an earlier PFL contract, because I do not recall this in the previous PFL contracts. But all it basically does, I don't want to be an alarmist. It's not the GFL ones were a little more nerve wracking because they were such a long date before they had to pay you. But basically, if the PFL does not get your money right away, they have up to 15 days to do it if you send a written notice at that point. So it gives them some leeway if they fail to pay you in a timely manner.
All right. We're going to move down into Section 8, Fighter Obligations. Section 8.3 and 8.4. Fighters shall not refuse MMA bouts against opponents designated by PFL for reasons other than injury, illness, or disability. In the event that fighter suffers any injury, illness, disability, or impairment of any nature which prevents fighter from engaging in MMA bouts or could negatively impact fighter's ability to be licensed to engage in MMA bouts, fighter or his authorized representative will immediately notify PFL in writing and supply any available medical reports related thereto. What does that one mean?
Well, this is kind of alarming to me in some sense. MMA fighters are independent contractors, right? And you're engaging in mutually agreed combat. That's the nature of the sport. That's in some ways that's why in New York there's a case that argues that fighters cannot be employees because of that. You have to get that consent in boxing to fight another person and engage in something to hurt the other person. And so you could never be an employee, because then you'd be covered by workman's comp, and your employer they can't be responsible for that because you're determining to engage in fighting with someone, right? Here, though, this is what it says: is you cannot refuse an MMA bout against opponent for any reason other than injury, illness, or disability. As an independent contractor, you're supposed to have the right to choose for any reason why you don't want to fight someone, right? There's provisions that, which I think are unfair in MMA, that extend the contract to that point, but there's nothing that says you have to fight someone. And there's many reasons you might not want. It's like it doesn't work on your schedule that date. Listen, I got a wedding, I got my parents' funeral, I can't make it for something like that. You might not want to fight in a certain place because of whatever reason. I mean, can you imagine someone having a fight in a country that's somewhere in, let's say, the Middle East with all the turmoil, and you're either Jewish or Muslim going to a country that you do not feel comfortable in, right? Or Ukrainian having to go to Russia or something where there's a conflict going on. All those are legitimate reasons why you would not want to take part and to go to a certain country or a certain location. So we can just come up with multiple, endless amount of imaginary scenarios where someone might not want to take a fight. And here they're saying there's only 3 reasons.
What about visa issues?
Well, I'm sure that would be kind of covered, but that's under a different other clause that says if you can't get your licensing or agreement, that's up to the fighter. But here they're saying you can't turn down the fight. You can't for any reason. I mean, what if it's your brother you're assigned to fight, a sibling or something like that?
Yeah.
I think that's a legitimate reason not to take a fight. And this, they're saying whatever fighter they offer you, you have to take. And that does not seem to work in the confines of how combat sports are technically supposed to work.
All right, we're going to move to section 8.4. At all times during the term, fighter agrees that the fighter will be on time for all promotional activities and MMA bouts be available to PFL. In parentheses, it says PFL must have a way to contact fighter. Fighter must show professionalism and respect. Should the fighter be more than 15 minutes late to any promotional activity or rules meeting without notifying PFL with an excusable reason, the fighter is subject to a per occurrence fine of up to 5% of fighter's compensation for the applicable MMA bout to be determined at PFL's discretion. Should the fighter be more than 15 minutes late to any MMA bout for any reason, the PFL may cancel the MMA bout and have no payment of any kind to fighter, or PFL may proceed with the fight with a 50% reduction of compensation to fighter, whichever is the decision of the PFL to be determined in PFL's discretion. Boy, that one sounds bad.
Well, I mean, what's funny is GFL had something very similar. So are they ripping off each other? Because in MMA, contracts are always ripped off from other promoters, and someone saw someone's contract and ripped the other one off. But again, there's a penalty for being. Again, we talked about this last time with GFL, I believe too. How are you late for a fight?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're late for the fight doesn't take place. You're late for the fight. That's the way I always assumed it would be. Or do they mean you're late for the weigh? I mean, not the weigh-ins, but the pre-fight preamble that you're supposed to do all the check-in stuff. I'm not clear, but the PFL has gone with way of penalties for fighters that have failed to do their duty in this.
All right, we're going to move down to section 8.10, and this is clearly their gambling policy. Fighters shall not directly or indirectly wager or attempt to wager on the outcome of any other aspect of any MMA bout or any other PFL or other MMA competition. B, solicit, facilitate, or encourage any person or entity to wager on the outcome or any other aspect of any MMA bout or any other PFL or other MMA competition. C, appear in advertising or promotions for any wagering or betting entity except for participating in PFL advertising and promotion activities as directed by PFL. D, contrive or attempt to contrive the outcome or any other aspect of any MMA bout or other PFL or other MMA competition. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yeah,
John, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to read that whole thing, but it's a lot. But it just covers all the bases. And basically, it's the same. We've seen this ever since we had the betting scandal in the UFC with Krause. And certain issues with fighter injuries that were, people assumed were betting scandals on themselves, and they're coming down hard on trying to wager or doing anything that could influence the betting. I think what's interesting is appear in advertising and promotion of any wagering, except, with participants of the PFL, who just like the UFC is going to be involved in collecting all the money they can from all the betting sites. Fighters are not allowed to do that, but the promoters sure as hell are allowed to be linked to gambling sites. And the other thing, it goes beyond just the fighter. It affects their friends and family. So it's very far reaching. You can see that because there's so much money in gambling now, because gambling sites are offering so much money to sports entities and fight business as well, they are very protective. They're putting language in their contracts to protect that. And they're laying all of it on the fighters.
A little further down in section 8.11, 8.11, there's something there, disparagement acts. What is that?
Well, we've seen disparagement acts, or in other contracts, even the UFC, one championship, as we know in their contract, is a very strong one, and basically it is that a fighter cannot malign or disparage the PFL or PFL constituents. Fighters shall not engage in any act, and that will look bad, basically, upon the PFL. The primary one, too, is the fighter will not involve himself in criminal misconduct or acts of moral turpitude. So while one championship contracts we noted earlier and other promotions that have these stronger disparagement acts often reflect on, like, you can't just talk bad. The way they're written broadly, you can't talk bad. This is limited much more to the idea that you cannot do something that impugns the promotion. And I get that from this, it doesn't sound like that'd be like talking bad, but it's stuff that's so offensive that it would look bad upon them. So it's wide reaching in some ways, but it's also narrow in the sense that it's not as silent. Remember we talked about previous contracts, there was a chilling effect, it seemed, from those clauses like this. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give credit to PFL on this. It does not seem to have it on this one.
Okay. So basically that's kind of like their own little code of conduct.
Well, the code of conduct is a little different, but this is basically like, you cannot just behavior. You cannot do something that's going to make them look bad. If you do, we're going to, we will go find you, fire you, do something to get rid of you.
All right. So we're going to move all the way down to Section 18, suspension and termination. If fighter breaches any material provision of this agreement, and or if any of the following additional circumstances occur, each of which, for clarity, shall constitute a breach of a material provision of this agreement, PFL shall have the right, upon notice to fighter, to suspend the term for a reasonable period until the applicable breach is resolved, withhold compensation otherwise payable to fighter, and or, in PFL's sole discretion, terminate this agreement for cause. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that John is getting ready to go through right now. To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!